I'm Cameron Harsh. I am the U.S. Director of Programs for World Animal Protection. And for those of you who may not be familiar with us yet, World Animal Protection is a global nonprofit organization working to end the suffering of farmed and wild animals worldwide and to eliminate the systems that exploit them. We have offices in 12 different countries around the world. And we work through courageous campaigning, public education, and policy change. And for over 70 years, we have been rewriting the story for animals. So in particular, we are working to protect farmed animals by calling for an end to factory farming. It is a system that exploits billions of animals each year. It is also having devastating impacts on the environment and our public health, as we'll hear about from our panelists. And we aim to build partnerships and work with governments and companies to build a food system that is humane, sustainable, equitable, and just. So that is our vision of the future of the food system. So today we have three great panelists that you'll be hearing from. We have Annette Manusevich, the Farming Campaign Manager at World Animal Protection. As the campaign manager, Annette works to advocate for farmed animals and change perceptions surrounding factory farming. She does this through education, outreach, and policy change. Annette brings her prior experience of working in the agriculture industry, advocating for environmental change and conservation practices adoption. She is based in Chicago, Illinois. We also have Craig Willingham. As Managing Director of the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute, Craig directs the Institute's multifaceted research efforts in food policy. His previous role at the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene's Center for Health Equity focused on devising strategies to enhance access to healthier food options. With a diverse professional background, encompassing business management, education, agriculture, and technical training, Craig's expertise plays a central role in advancing the Institute's mission in the realm of food policy. And finally, we have Patrick Jamet. Patrick was born and raised in the New York City restaurant family to French-Lebanese parents. He's a passionate CPG sales marketing professional and investor with a history of working with disruptive mission-forward brands such as Honest Tea, Sir Kensington's Condiments, Good Culture, and most currently with Meaty Foods. So I want to set the scene a little bit before turning it over to the panel. We have a short video clip to show, but as many of you are likely familiar, we cannot solve the climate crisis without addressing the way that we produce food, and in particular, from World Animal Protection's standpoint, the way we raise animals for food and the growth of meat and dairy production that has been sanctioned by governments around the world. Just sharing a few numbers, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, there are 92.2 billion land animals slaughtered for food each year globally. It's 92.2 billion. In the US alone, we slaughter over 9 billion chickens for meat. It's just one country and one species. To give an example from a company perspective, JBS, the world's largest producer and processor of animal products, every day, that's how astronomical these numbers are, every day they slaughter 13 million chickens, 128,000 pigs, and 77,000 cows. So that's one company that in a single year processes more than 4.5 billion chickens, 45 million pigs, and 26 million cows. To bring this around to climate, chicken production in just 4 countries, those being China, Brazil, the Netherlands, and the US, is responsible for 135 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions every year, equivalent to keeping 29 million cars on the road each year. That's chicken production in just 4 countries. From a World Animal Protection standpoint, we have a huge emphasis on pointing out the driver of animal feed crop production in climate change, land use change, and particularly wild animal habitat destruction. It requires roughly 2,800 pounds of corn to feed a cow to slaughter weight, which produces about 600 pounds of edible beef. That's about 4.6 pounds of corn per pound of edible animal protein. About 90 million acres of farmland in the US are used to grow corn alone, the majority of which is used for livestock feed or fuel ethanol production. A very limited amount is for human food consumption. Turning the picture to soybeans, soybean production globally is 13 times higher today than it was in the 1960s, and 69% of soybeans are grown in just the US and Brazil. More than 3/4 of the global soy is fed to farmed animals, and about only 1/5 is going directly to human consumption. It is an inefficient system that is contributing to so much devastation, as we'll see in a moment. The biggest climate change and environmental impacts within factory farming systems are coming from this animal feed crop production. The land use change, the production and processing of these animal feed crops, and their global transportation. They're driving deforestation, carbon releases into the atmosphere, the threat of habitat destruction for wild animals, and the deaths of wild animals. And this hidden cost is something that we hope to expose and turn people away from factory farmed meat and dairy products. So one of our country offices is in Brazil, and they produced a 13-minute documentary called Forest for Feed that we will show just a short clip of for you all to help set the stage.
Quando o meio ambiente ele sofre uma degradação, nós sofremos também.
Se a gente perde essa Amazônia, a gente perde uma série de espécies que só ocorrem nessa região do Brasil.
A agropecuária, no mundo todo, é o mais importante vetor de destruição da biodiversidade, segundo o painel que estuda isso nas Nações Unidas.
Era tudo mato. Era floresta, né? Era tudo floresta. Começa sempre assim, né? Primeiro, arranca a madeira. Muitos motosserra, né? Entrava dentro da mata e parecia uns besouros, né? E derrubando, né? As madeiras. Eles passam o correntão, né? Passa o correntão, derruba o mato, passa o trator, né? Depois que derruba a madeira, aí vem o fogo, né? Aí vem a pastagem. Depois que devastou tudo mesmo, que depois de virar pastagem, aí passa a plantar o grão.
So hopefully that gave you a sense of the scale of the problem that we're talking about and the amount of destruction that is happening, in this case, in the Brazilian Amazon, but is certainly not exclusive to that region in terms of converting wild animals, habitats, and their homes into animal feed cropping systems and agriculture systems. Factory farming is simply misaligned with a food-secure and climate-safe future, and big meat and dairy corporations often hide behind this myth that factory farms are necessary to feed the world. And from World Animal Protection's standpoint, it is imperative that we get out in front of this myth and explain that there is a better way and a better food system that works for animals, people, and planet. And that is what I'm hoping we can cover with the amazing panelists today. So a key purpose of this panel is we want to help set the path forward for a food system that is protective and not exploitative. So first and foremost, I just invite each of the panelists to provide a brief summary, about 5 minutes, please, of how your work is contributing to building a more climate-friendly and sustainable food system. And maybe I'll start at the far end and work towards me. So Annette.
Hi everyone, hopefully you can hear me okay. Yeah, Cameron did a great job setting up the work that we do at World Animal Protection. World Animal Protection in recent years has actually pivoted towards a more strategic approach to create a circular food systems campaigns approach. This approach encompasses a broader, more circular perspective to aid animals. It's a dedicated focus on meat reduction, climate change mitigation, and the profound consequences of factory farming on both our public health and animal well-being. Through our advocacy and campaign work, we're striving to create awareness and promote a transformative food system. Our efforts are geared towards addressing the root cause of these issues and to end animal suffering forever. And along that path, mitigating climate change and championing a more sustainable and compassionate world for both present and future generations.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Craig Willingham. Again, I'm the Managing Director for the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute. And before I jump into the work that we're doing that directly impacts climate change, I'll talk a little bit about our institute and what we do. So the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute is a research and action center based at the CUNY Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy, and we work on a wide variety of food policy related topic areas. Everything from jobs in the food sector to the connections between agricultural producers and urban consumers. We do a lot of work looking at the intersection between the built environment and food policy and food access. And we do a fair amount of work looking at food insecurity issues. And our work really falls into 4 different categories. We have our classic research and analysis work where we identify a topic that we think is important, research that topic, and produce an academic paper, a policy brief, or some similar report. We have our evaluation work where we're brought in by third parties to evaluate the effectiveness of policies and programs that they may be involved in. We have our advocacy work where we work with food policy advocates around the country to provide evidence to support food policy change that they're interested in seeing. And then we have our public programming, which consists of our monthly food policy newsletter, which goes out to about 7,000 people, and our monthly food policy forums where we bring together academics, elected officials, researchers, and others who are working on a given food policy topic. And in terms of climate change, we have a couple of different initiatives that we're currently working on. And just to provide you with some further context about the work we do, we have between 18 and 25 projects going on at any given time. And today I'm going to talk very briefly about a couple of the ones that, again, touch specifically on climate change. One is our work with the Good Food Purchasing Program, which some of you may be familiar with. The Good Food Purchasing Program is a values-based procurement framework that provides municipalities and others with a way to transform their current procurement practices into ones that are more environmentally sustainable, ones that support a valued workforce, ones that are focused on animal welfare, and also ensures that the food that's being served to people who are engaged with food service with cities, states, etc., is healthy food. And the 5 value categories really provide an opportunity for cities to think differently about the way they purchase food. For example, New York City is the largest institutional food buyer in the country behind the US military, spending about $300 million a year on purchasing food for schools, senior centers, after-school programs, etc. And that puts them in a position to have enormous buying power when it comes to getting producers to act differently, whether that means taking an approach that limits their impact on greenhouse gases, whether that means making sure that they're treating workers fairly, on and on and on. And our work within the GFPP is focused specifically on New York City and New York State, helping to draft legislation here at the city and state level to make it easier for, at the state level, municipalities all around the state to be able to change their practices to incorporate values like environmental sustainability and health and wellness into their contracts. And in the city, we're looking to make sure that the sort of indicators that we want to be able to track to make sure that the city is representing the values of New Yorkers in terms of their hiring practices, their contracting practices, their environmental sustainability practices. We want to see those more explicitly built into contracts. And the work that we're doing, both on the legislative front and the advocacy front, is part of the process to ensuring that that's the case. One of our other projects that we've just recently launched is a climate-friendly food service certificate that we're working with 3 of the schools within the CUNY system, 3 of the junior colleges that have a food service program. We're also partnering with Compass and some of the other larger food service producers to help to craft a certification similar to a food handler's license that would teach folks who are learning about culinary practices for commercial purposes, teach them about different ways to source and to handle products in order to have a lesser impact on the environment. So this is something that we're hoping to create a wider certification that will be used beyond New York City once we're able to do a little pilot phase here in the next year. But it's something that we're very excited about, and we think that having those sorts of trainings, and in some cases making them mandatory, is one of the clear ways forward to making sure that climate-friendly food practices are being done in commercial food service.
Awesome. So I work for a company called Meaty Foods. I'm on the leadership team, and our mission at its highest level is to help feed the world forever. And we do that through an ingredient platform called mycelium, which is also known as mushroom root. We're based in Boulder, Colorado. We just launched about a year ago, and our goal is to help create availability for a cleaner, more sustainable food ingredient platform. And so, our mycelium it's grown ourselves. It's, it really starts off, it's, in our opinion, one of the most efficient ways to grow protein from sun to your plate, and also one of the most nutrient-dense ingredients. So for us, we see our mission as helping to drive availability and awareness around what's possible outside of animal meat, and help people rethink what meat is. Often meat is just associated with animal meat, but we think meat could be far wider and more holistic than that. So we produce everything ourselves in Boulder, Colorado, in our own facility. In just a few days, we start with a teaspoon worth of spores that 3-4 days later turn into a few hundred cows worth of meat. And it's, all the products we make are 95% one ingredient, so extremely nutrient dense and just very efficient to grow. So we're working with the Whole Foods of the world and the Sprouts Markets of the world to make it available to people. And what you have is a whole muscle protein that's, like I said, 95% one single ingredient with no added nutrition, all naturally occurring. So 1.0 PDCAAS protein, loaded with fiber, B vitamins, iron, and a really unique ingredient platform that, we're starting with the meat alternative category, but for us, sky's the limit in all the categories that it could be utilized with.
Great, thank you all. Another question for you all to each answer in turn. And maybe we'll start with Patrick and go back the opposite way. So our food system, as I kind of discussed in my overview, is now heavily rooted in industrial scale agriculture, which we also call factory farms. You might hear concentrated or confined animal feeding operations, or CAFOs. This production system has been linked to a variety of harms to animals, to natural resources, and to our communities and community health. I'm so curious to hear from each of you, what is a key area of impact or harm from factory farming that your work sees as a priority to address? And how can holding agriculture accountable for its climate impact specifically be part of this?
Sure. So, for us, balance is a big thing. One of our founders actually grew up on a regenerative bison ranch. And, for us, we see media as an and, not an or, but helping to really alleviate the pressure that factory farming has done to small family farms and regenerative grown meat. So for us, it's really about balance and helping to bring that back into a calibration of sorts.
So with our work, I'll again mention our work with the Good Food Purchasing Program Coalition. And if I didn't mention it before, the GFPP has 5 value categories. There's animal welfare, environmental sustainability, health and wellness, valued workforce, and local economies. And I think that the more municipalities that we can get to adopt the Good Food Purchasing Programs framework, the bigger impact we can have in terms of making sure that producers are aware that there are different things that go into the sorts of contracts that they'll have to respond to beyond just the lowest possible price, and start to take into account things like animal welfare and valued workforce. And we think in particular, New York City and the outsized impact that it can have by making sure that the vendors that are looking to do business with the city are adhering to stronger standards, more specific standards, to make sure that the animals that are involved in their production are being raised humanely, to make sure that the people who are working on those processing lines are being treated fairly, and making sure that there is an expectation on behalf of producers in terms of the standards in which we would like to see them adhere to, but also understanding that it's not just going to be business as usual moving forward. Cities like New York are leading the way in terms of climate change initiatives, whether that be regulation and legislation or just simply focusing on things that are directly under their control in terms of procurement. And I think the more action that we take sets a precedent and changes the expectations for doing business going forward. So I think our work, making sure that the things that the city is doing are meaningful or substantive, and that when we talk about taking action on climate change, it's more than just sort of window dressing, that we're expecting to see substantive change in terms of the sorts of ways in which vendors are doing business, both on their own and the way in which they're doing business with the city.
Yeah, at World Animal Protection, we are strongly focused on ending factory farming. We feel that factory farming is at the root cause of a lot of these issues that are affecting our public health and our communities and the well-being of animals. So we have this overarching goal of working with key stakeholders and legislators to get a ban on factory farms and the expansion of factory farming, as well as improving the lives of animals that are already a part of this system. Through our campaigns and public awareness approach, we've launched several reports and had several offline events that focus on raising awareness around this issue and educating the public about alternatives or ways that they can get involved, as well as how corporations can be held responsible for being a part of this issue, and really targeting the key stakeholders in this space for this. Yeah. Sorry.
Thanks. So a question for...
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Craig.
I see my son just called, and he never calls me, so it might be an emergency.
Oh, please, yeah.
So I need to step out for a second. My apologies.
Absolutely. Family safety and well-being is important and supported. So we'll jump to Patrick then, a question for you. As a company committed to scaling up an alternative to conventional animal proteins, curious to hear a little bit more on how Meaty's approach aligns with creating a more climate-friendly food system, and how animal welfare and environmental impacts are an important factor in the products you choose and the animal-free direction that you see the food system going.
Yeah, I mean, so I mentioned one of our founders grew up on a bison ranch, and a regenerative one where they're, kind of doing everything as humanely as possible, and where animals are on pasture where they're supposed to be, not in small little cages eating grain. And so I think this the over-reliance on factory farming has kind of suffocated the small family farms that are doing it right. And so we see media as an and, not an or, but to help bring balance to that whole food system where we're not relying on it. And quite frankly, with the way pricing is, these small factory farms, these small family farms, quite frankly, get suffocated and aren't able to really, grow meat the way they want to as responsibly as possible. So with our process and our ingredient, we see that as a huge benefit, not only on the supply and the availability, and we're partnering with Whole Foods and Sprouts to make that available to consumers, but also the downstream nutrition impacts. And one thing we're seeing from talking to a lot of consumers is that this desire and this obviously trend to eat more plant-based is not going away. It's only going to continue to grow, but there is a little bit of fatigue around the nutrition and the ingredient profiles that you see out in the market today. So that's where we think bringing this whole system into balance in a sense, and allowing to celebrate some of these small family farms, and quite frankly allowing them to charge more for what they're selling, and have people kind of primarily rely on plant-based options as their primary source.
I'm sorry, could you repeat, is there a question that was directed for me?
That was specific to Patrick.
Okay,
though.
and again,
Yeah.
my apologies. My son he's 11, he just started taking the subway by himself, so if I get a phone call from him, I have to take it.
Yeah, absolutely. A question for Annette. It'd be great to hear you elaborate on the connection between animal welfare and the health of ecosystems in our food system more broadly, and how transitioning to a more sustainable food system can benefit both animals and the environment.
Yeah, as you saw in the short clip that our wonderful Brazil office colleagues produced, and hope you can find the time to watch the whole video, animal agriculture is immensely responsible for the loss of native habitats and deforestation and decline in biodiversity. So the ecosystems are being depleted due to the impacts of factory farming. The connection between animal welfare, the health of ecosystems, and the impact of factory farming, they're deeply intertwined. So one affects the other very significantly. Ecosystems serve as vital habitats for various wildlife species, and any disruption or degradation in these ecosystems can have a vast impact on the welfare of these animals. One of the primary culprits, as I've mentioned, is factory farming, which has far-reaching consequences. Factory farming, through a lot of research, has been associated with habitat destruction, deforestation, and the simplification of these ecosystems. And it often leads to vast tracts of land being converted into intensive livestock operations. This practice, it displaces a lot of the wild animals and their homes and results in the loss of the biodiversity. And the simplified ecosystems prioritizes a limited number of domesticated animal species and plants. So the transitioning to a more sustainable food system actually becomes more relevant in this context, and sustainable agriculture is a core component of creating more expansive ecosystems and not leading to this depletion of resources. It also has been linked to reducing greenhouse gases as well. So we're really advocating for promoting plant-based diets and this shift to more sustainable food systems through that approach. And actually, our organization conducted a new research study that'll be released next week that links major meat industry players to illegal deforestation in Brazil, and also links animal cruelty and the stealing of indigenous land in Brazil as well. So please stay tuned for our launch of that next week. Little promo.
Thanks, Annette. And a question for Craig. So the Institute, as you've mentioned, is really working to address policy change at the local level, and particularly addressing, food disparities and community food issues. So I'm curious to hear more about what role community engagement plays in your work at the Institute and building a better food system.
Sure. So a lot of our work is really focused on providing evidence that a host of different stakeholders can use. We try to present our information in a way that's user-friendly enough that elected officials can use it, folks who are going to be speaking at city council meetings, community board meetings, industry, trade group gatherings, a host of other settings beyond just being academic papers that are going to be talked about at academic conferences. And we take our role as a research and action center very seriously, and we think part of that role is having a robust community engagement approach. And our approach to doing that is making sure that we, in almost all the work that we do, are collaborating with community partners, whether that be CBOs and civil society groups, or individual coalitions of residents who are interested in a food policy issue that affects their local neighborhood. We think that by partnering with community-based organizations and community advocates, it provides our work with a gravitas that folks who are simply just doing sort of classic academic work, that their work doesn't necessarily have. Furthermore, we believe that our work needs to be driven by the desires of community stakeholders and community partners. We want to make sure that we're speaking to the desires and concerns of the people around us and making sure that the work that we're producing is useful. And in that sense, we think that policy can have an enormous impact on changing the way that our city operates. We believe that making sure that we're taking a look at the outcomes as opposed to the outputs of what's happening in the food system is one of the clear ways where we can make sure that we're on the right track. We often hear lots of numbers bandied around, particularly in New York City. We fed 100,000 students or 1 million students, or we provided meals for 100,000 families in need. But our question is always, what's the outcome of that? It's great that we're supporting so many people and that we're helping so many people, but has anything substantively changed? And we want to make sure that our work is providing evidence to say these are the benchmarks that we should be using, these are the goals that we should be setting in order to actually change the outcome in terms of the city's impact on the climate, as opposed to just sort of talking about how, counting how many activities we're doing or how many programs we're involved with. And we think that often legislation is the best way to do that. And the work that we do, one of the primary things, rather, we look for our work to do is to inform a legislative approach towards making sure that there's a binding approach to any sort of policy change action that we're looking to make in terms of climate change.
Great, thanks. So the next several questions are open to anyone who wants to answer, and so anyone can start, whoever chooses to. But I'd be curious to hear what role meat reduction plays in all of your work and your vision for a future food system, and what strategies you found to be effective.
This one. So yeah, for us, meat reduction is a core component of our campaigns and plays a pivotal role within that framework. We believe meat reduction has the potential to impact our food system in a major way. So from an individual impact and targeting corporate stakeholders and legislators, meat reduction is kind of one of our key platforms. And so through that work, we really advocate a shift towards plant-based diets. We really like to meet people in the middle and kind of advocate for, you don't have to go, plant-based overnight, but really a reduction in your animal product consumption does make a difference. And we've seen that through our reports that even just a small change makes a difference in our overall food system. So the more we can advocate for that, the better on an individual scale. And then if we're talking about our corporate scale, working with the big players in this industry, either the meat producers and animal product producers, to adopt a more animal welfare-centric approach and to reduce their product production, as well as working with the grocery stores and the restaurants to adopt more plant-based products in their line of offerings, and again, working with legislators and when key moments of bills that support plant-based options and adoption of more options in areas like schools or hospitals and public spaces come up, we're really encourage our supporters and get involved in that legislative space as well.
Yeah, so this is kind of core to how we're going to market in a sense. And, for us, I think, I mentioned our founder again, and, we're really, our product is perfect for vegans and vegetarians who are currently part of that diet lifestyle. But we really go after the flexitarians and people and meat eaters. That represents, 80–90% of the population. And if you can get someone who's eating meat 7 days a week, 2–3 meals a day, to start incorporating plant-based into their diet, that's how we're going to start moving the needle. So for us, a lot of our positioning is not around demonizing meat, it's around demonizing factory farmed meat and getting people to be a little bit more intentional about the meat they eat. And so, for us, the product we have, I think it's a proposition that lights up in that sense. And so, we're not just working with plant-based chefs, we work with barbecue chefs and restaurants, and we're trying to make it a little bit more appealing to a meat eater and something that's a little bit less of a shift and feels like less of a full lifestyle shift, just to get things moving in that direction. And so that's a big part of kind of how we position the brand. And we try not to guilt trip people too much, and just want them to be a little bit more intentional and stop for a second and think about the choices they're making and what the upstream and downstream impact of them is.
And I would just say for our work, in terms of meat reduction, part of our mission is to normalize the conversation around meat reduction and not make it such a sort of shocking proposition when you're talking about the various ways in which we're going to address climate change in the future. And to that end, we provide evidence to show that meat reduction really needs to be part of the discussion, and it can't simply be a situation where we, for lack of a better phrase, nibble around the edges and not really deal with one of the core issues when it comes to climate change. And we have to be clear of our expectations of where we need to be as a society, and also we need to be clear that it's going to be difficult and not shy away from those conversations. And for our part, our work takes a very sort of practical and direct approach to getting that message out and providing the evidence to back that up.
Great, thanks. So shifting into kind of the innovation space, and I know innovative is a word that gets tossed around quite a lot, but curious to hear from each of your perspective, if there is a particular initiative, be that a product, a new technology, a campaign idea, a policy solution, if there is a particular initiative that holds special promise for transforming our food system, yeah, just kind of, if there's that one thing.
Yeah, so again, for us, we see our ingredient platform, Mycelium, as having so much potential in more than just the meat category. With how fast it grows, how nutrient dense it is, and its ability to just deliver. Within a few days, you have a few 100,000 pounds. So for us, we look at more than just meat and how we can use this technology and this ingredient platform for baked goods, for dairy, for other categories that are putting a strain on our food systems. And, we're starting with meat. It's a huge opportunity. It's center of plate. It's a big part of the American diet and one of the biggest opportunities to clean up. And so for us, we see mycelium as being potentially a solution for universal basic protein, but even past that, baked goods, dairy, other aisles in the grocery store.
I can't say that I do see one or even a handful of innovative products or ideas that are really going to meet the challenge that we face. So I believe that we're at a point of crisis, and it's going to take a radical transformation of society, which is something that a lot of people don't want to hear, but it's the truth. We've waited too long, in my mind, to make the sort of decisions that we need to make, and it's not going to be just one thing or even a handful of things. It's going to take an approach that is going to be multifaceted and acknowledge the reality of where we need to get to. We were talking a bit earlier before the panel, and I mentioned a book. It's a work of fiction that came out recently called The Ministry of the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson, that really looks at the practical ways in which governments around the world are going to need to change in order to address climate change. And I think that that's a sort of a really interesting and imaginative vision on what could be done and what needs to be done. I imagine it might be some variation on that, but as far as a very sort of, at least in a fictional context, a somewhat detailed thinking through of what's the challenges we face and what will need to be done from a policy and administrative standpoint, it's a good sort of thought exercise.
Yeah, I'll echo Craig's notion that there really is no Band-Aid solution when it comes to a fix for our climate crisis. I think that we need to, like I mentioned previously, it's a really multifaceted approach that has a circular vision that is very intertwined with each other, and that one area affects the other, and that there really needs to be a bridging of those gaps to kind of move forward and have a systematic food approach to changing how we can consume our food. But I will say that we tend to try to stay up ahead of the innovations and trends that are going and look towards the future, and that we think that the cultivated meat or cell-based meat definitely has potential. I think it's in such an early developmental stage that there's so many opinions, and it really has a long way to go. But as someone who's been eating plant-based foods and loves trying new products for the past 10 years, it's really come a long way. I don't know if any of you remember what the plant-based scene used to look like 10 years ago, but it was slim pickings. And I think that it's come such a long way, and it's become a lot more of the norm, at least in the spaces that I see, but that cultivated meat and cell-based meat, albeit its challenges, has the potential to kind of create a more compassionate and sustainable approach towards meat alternatives, if you want to call it an alternative, for the future.
And I would just add that, one of the mantras we used when I was at the Department of Health is making the healthy choice the easy choice. You can make the same case for climate-friendly consumption, making that choice the easy choice. And one of the things that New York City has done, which isn't necessarily new or even novel, but they've started Meatless Mondays in school, and again, the largest school system in the country, serving almost a million children. That's a huge impact. And they're also doing Plant-Based Fridays, where they're offering a plant-based option only on Fridays. And having the largest school system in the country to do that, again, sends a signal to industry, but it also shows what's possible at scale. And I think that that's, again, while not 100% innovative, I think that's something that's done at a scale that's pretty bold.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly sounds like something that can be replicated in innovative ways and built upon. And that segues nicely into the next question, which is really about challenges and obstacles. And as we know, transitioning to a climate-friendly food system is not without its challenges, or we might be further along than we are at the moment. So curious to hear from each of you a main obstacle or a couple of obstacles that you seem to continuously encounter in your work to build a new food system, and how you might propose overcoming them.
You know, one thing I'll say, I think, as we look at a more climate-friendly food system is a watch out around making sure we don't create a less nutritious food system downstream, and because that will just create a whole other host of problems. So keeping that in mind when we're thinking about climate-friendly solutions and making sure that nutrition and ingredients are kind of kept at the forefront there. You know, for us, it's, you know, as we talk to retailers, and it's really adoption. It's really getting options in front of people. And you know, there's that Thomas Ford quote where he said, if I asked my consumers what they wanted, they said they want a faster horse. So oftentimes consumers don't know what's possible and what's out there, and I think it's, you know, working with retailers and you know, our commercial partners to just get it out there and make it more accessible and make it feel less daunting to kind of shift in that direction.
My answer is not so original. Fossil fuel companies, billionaires, people who are invested in the current system and aren't willing to make any changes until we're at the absolute brink of collapse. Those are the biggest barriers to my mind.
Yeah, I'll echo that sentiment that I think a lot of the public perception is due to just the impact and influence that the meat and animal product and factory farming industry has. They really, I think, dictate what the consumer buys and what they think about the market. Like, the labeling on these products really indicates what people buy and see as, take at face value. So I think kind of combating that public perception and raising awareness around these issues, and as an animal advocacy org, it's really our job to connect with these companies and sort of call them out on the wrongdoings that they are taking part in, and move the consumer and individual away from those products and really expanding the education and awareness. Also say that legislation plays a huge role. I think that we are at the point where it's just not regulatory enough towards that end, and there isn't enough legislation that helps us in the plant-based and animal advocacy movement, and so we've kind of come to a wall with that as well.
Cool. And so Climate Week is really all about bringing a variety of stakeholders from different sectors all together to talk about these very important and timely issues. So I'm curious if any or each of you have any great, strong, successful examples of cross-sector collaboration in this space.
I can jump in again. Yeah, I think partnerships have been incredibly valuable working in our space. As a somewhat smaller nonprofit organization, we kind of get our momentum from our collaboration, whether that be via working with corporations, working with other NGOs, and being a part of the coalitions that we are part of. They really give power to our movement. When a lot of people are aligned with the same mission, move towards that future. I'll say specifically, we've been able, our supporters have been involved in contacting legislators to pass the Prop 12 bill in California, and then also passing the New Jersey crate ban. And then our coalition work has assisted us in putting out scorecard reports. Like we are part of the Antibiotics Off the Menu Coalition. We released a report ranking restaurants and grocery sectors on their antibiotic policies, and including animal welfare components. And so those scorecards really allow us to reach out to corporations and kind of get their statement and put out more transparency when it comes to their policies. And yeah, we've been able to forge a lot of partnerships working with plant-based organizations and create events like this panel as well. So it's just, yeah, invaluable, our collaborative work.
So in terms of this issue, most of our collaborative work has been with the Good Food Purchasing Program Coalition, and having that framework of the GFPP has allowed us to forge a shared agenda and shared goals across different sectors that aren't necessarily immediately connected on the surface. So understanding that what happens in terms of animal welfare is connected with what happens in terms of valued workforce and the way that workers are treated who are in processing plants, and understanding how that's connected to the environmental impact of the way in which processing plants and also the farming of animals is being done, and making sure that that connection is clear for the various groups that are invested in the individual value categories, but also understanding how, as we move forward, as we look to strengthen protections, as we look to make sure that cities are representing the values of their citizens in terms of who they're buying from and how they're procuring, I think has made a huge difference for making sure that these groups can collaborate in a way that's clear and that's connected, and showing them that we're all moving forward together towards a shared set of goals.
Great, thanks. So I have a couple of other questions, but noting that some people might be leaving at the top of the hour for other Climate Week events, I wanted to open it up to the audience for any questions, and we will have Emily bring a microphone around if you want to just toss your hand up, and we'll come to you as soon as we see them. Got a question on this side.
Hey. Thanks, guys, for presenting. My question's more for Craig. What kind of challenges or responses do you hear from maybe hospitals or schools when trying to implement a plant-based, catering menu or stuff like that? Why isn't it being done, do you think? Is it more from pushback from citizens? I know elementary school might be from parents, but for like higher education hospitals or even just city events, why is it not a fully plant-based menu yet, do you think?
Well, I think for hospitals in particular, and I'll tackle that first, it depends on whether it's a public hospital or a private hospital. If it's a public hospital, all public entities, at least in New York State, and most states have a similar sort of stipulation, have to adhere to state procurement guidelines that tends to elevate what they call the lowest responsible bidder. So this is, if you have a contract for, let's say, hamburger, the contract that's going to be scored the highest is the one that's going to come in at the cheapest price without sacrificing quality. But the definition of quality has nothing to do with, or isn't connected with the environmental impact or the way that workers are treated or any host of things. And so the fact that it's a sort of race to the bottom when it comes to procurement, and that's the way that the people who are involved with contracting and procuring, both on the hospital side and on the producer side, everyone's thinking in terms of the lowest cost. The sorts of concerns we're talking about today really don't come into play, and that's really one of the biggest hurdles. The way of thinking when it comes to procuring and focusing so exclusively on price really is one of the biggest challenges. And I think but beyond that, just institutional food practices in general, there's a way in which things have been done in terms of making meals on site, the expectations on what's available and the quality of that. And oftentimes, the plant-based diets aren't part of the conversation just because historically they haven't been. So part of the reason why New York City has made a lot of progress in its public hospitals is because both of the de Blasio administration, but in a much more accelerated way under Mayor Adams, there's been a clear conversation, a clear focus on making sure that plant-based, or they call it plant-forward, is the approach for public hospitals. And that's made an enormous impact on the willingness of these sort of entrenched bureaucracies to change the way they do things. So that's really one of the biggest, those two things, both procurement law and procurement practice, are two of the biggest challenges in the public hospital sector. In the private hospital sector, it really just depends on what hospital you're at. Some hospitals, private hospitals currently have a pretty robust plant-based food service approach, and others have historically, because they offer a service and they offer a level of quality often when it comes to these sort of secondary things that public hospitals haven't been able to provide because of costs. So it really just depends on the setting. And in terms of schools, you deal with some of the same issues. Again, entrenched thinking. There's also for school meals, if it's a public school, you know, there I think it's $1.80 is the maximum cost that meals can per meal that the schools can get reimbursed from the federal government, and that also puts a limitation on how flexible they can be with the school menu. And there has to be a willingness to be creative and to figure out how that restrictive budget can be used in a way that allows for a plant-based / plant-forward approach. So I would say half of it is institutional thinking and the other half are regulatory and legal hurdles.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks for the question. We've got one. Okay.
Good afternoon. I'm Simi Thambi. I'm a climate economist at a London-based investor network. I work for FAIR Initiative. FAIR stands for Farm Animals Investment Risk and Return. So in mission, we are completely aligned. We want to end factory farming. Now, my question is around, given that we work a lot with investors, what kind of action would you like from the part of investors who invest in these, big livestock companies? What action can they do to prod these companies into, making their supply chains more efficient or sustainable?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, we would hope for divestment from these problematic companies and really show, I think people vote with their dollar, and the investment from these major corporations is a big part of that. And so really assessing where these companies stand in terms of their environmental impact, their human health impact, and their impact on animals all across the board. And they kind of are showing you how they are acting via their practices. And so if the company isn't, the best when it comes to those things, really divesting from those areas. But I also think that in terms of sustainability, the investment towards more sustainable practices like regenerative agriculture and more biodiversity friendly practices would be extremely helpful, and kind of providing education and awareness about where that money is flowing within the system.
I mean, I'll also say, we've raised quite a bit of money at Meaty, almost $250 million last year alone, and the best investors are ones that are aligned with the mission and almost take kind of a B Corp approach to it, and not just solely looking at the P&L returns. And it takes a little bit of a leap of faith in some cases, but really being aligned with the mission and like Craig said, kind of more of the outcomes rather than just the output, the financial outputs of investing in a company. I think that's really big, and giving founders and giving brands that are trying to move the needle in that direction a little bit more runway and a little bit more faith. So I think that's always big, is when you have mission-aligned investors that are not just there for a 3 to 5 year IRR. They're there to create impact and change in the long term.
Yeah, and if I could just add.
I'll just add one thing to be the wet blanket. I don't believe investors should play a role. I think that this is beyond investment, it's beyond business as usual. I think if we're bringing the profit motive into the conversation when it comes to how we get ourselves out of this, I think it's doomed from the start. I would like to see more regulatory action in terms of regulating the way that capital is used. I don't think we'll see that in my lifetime, but I'm just not confident that investors can play a meaningful role, because they're only invested as far as or for as long as it's useful to them, and we need longer term thinking.
Yeah, and if I could just add, I think the longer term thinking is key, and I think the financial sector has come some way, but needs to go a lot further in terms of rethinking investment and returns on investment and how they're framing ROI and the incorporation of ESG in a much more dynamic way. I think in terms of the current system, institutions that either hold shares or own the debt of large meat and dairy companies, it's really about getting them to disclose in a very transparent manner the impacts of their supply chain and not allow them to mislead, claim net zero commitments when that doesn't include their soybean or their corn sourcing, and really make sure that these commitments are robust and actually leading to meaningful change and not just window dressing.
And it can be voluntary.
Yeah. Great question. Thanks. Other questions?
Hi, thank you all. So Patrick, you mentioned this regenerative bison farming, and I'm curious from all of you what regenerative looks like or what it means in this sort of like either animal industry context or agricultural context. And do you think it has a place in the food system, particularly when it comes to the meat industry, or should we be moving away from all meat altogether? And if it does have a place, how do we actually champion that?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not a farmer, but in my last brand, I worked for a company called Good Culture, which was a dairy brand that only worked with organic and pasture-raised family co-ops. And I've been to an organic dairy farm, and it's pretty stark when you see like just the vibrancy, the biodiversity. I mean, the whole notion of having cows on pasture with hundreds of species of plants. I mean, that's how the earth is supposed to work, right? And so obviously I know it's not fully natural, but at least moving the food system more in that direction rather than just relying on the factory farming and feeding cows what they're not supposed to be eating, which then also has downstream effects. So, for me it is we should celebrate that, but we can't feed the world with that approach on agriculture. So it's going to take a lot more than just that.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think a regenerative approach, I just don't know that it can be done at the scale that we would need to have it done in order to feed the population as it stands now. You mentioned the one company killed over 1 billion chickens in a year. Is that correct?
Yep.
I mean, the scale of that is just mind-boggling, and I don't think it's a sort of one-for-one where you would translate that scale of 1 billion chickens to 1 billion chicken capacity in regenerative agriculture. I don't know that can be done.
Yeah, I'll echo that statement that like the regenerative agriculture practices are great. I come from like a crop science, soil science background, so I think that it's the best way to produce those crops, but we're misdirecting like the crops that we produce. We could be growing crops on that land that would be more for human consumption directly, and we really need a shift in our food system and that approach, because we just can't feed the world in a way that is regenerative. And as diets are shifting more towards being open to meat alternatives, but also shifting more towards a heavy meat consumption, we just need to actually have a more systematic approach that shifts the land use away from a very like monoculture, feed heavy use, and more towards producing things like lentils and beans for our consumption. So really using the land for what it's made to do.
Yeah, there's a certain harmony in nature, a symbiotic harmony when different plants and animals and fungi work together. But again, it's not anywhere close to the scale that we need to feed the planet. So it's how do we not lose that and then add the solutions we need for scale.
And also, there's not an example of what I think, and I think probably we all agree, needs to be done, having been done in history. And I think we have to acknowledge that. And I think that even the fact that we can have a calm conversation about this right now tells us we're not where we need to be. It's going to be, sadly, I think, a crisis point that really starts to change the nature of the way that we do things, something equivalent to the Cold War. We aren't there yet. Even though we're seeing the impacts of climate change, it's still not impacting us in a way that's giving the average person the sense of urgency that we're likely going to need in order to make the transformations that are required.
Thanks. I think we could take one more question if there is one. Yeah, I thought there was one.
Hi, it's been really useful hearing all of your insights so far. So I'm the Plant-Based Universities Coordinator for Queen Mary University of London, and Plant-Based Universities is basically a campaign that aims to make universities 100% plant-based, or as plant-based as possible while remaining just and inclusive. So I'm aware that there's a student group here. They're a chapter of the Allied Scholars for Animal Protection, and they're trying to like do something similar to PBU in the UK. Like then they're trying to make Colombia plant-based as well. So what kind of like advice would you give them, and like what tips do you have for like grassroots campaigns like this?
So our work at the Institute, we work with students throughout the city university system on a number of different campaigns. And I think one of the things that we find is most valuable is that the voice of the students really represents the voice of the consumer, which is a sad thing, but also a good thing in terms of higher education. You have the power, you have the numbers, you have the dollars, and making your voice heard, making your desires heard, I think is often easier than students think that it is. The administrators will listen to you. I think what you have to do is to make sure that you have a clear message, and also make sure that there is a sort of, what's the term I'm looking for, a succession plan. Because with students, they're constantly coming and going. You have students that come in, they're freshmen, and students that graduate. And I think for a sustained campaign, a sustained approach towards changing the way in which your university or a group of universities do what they do, you have to have that single clear message, and also have that succession plan, so that as students come in, it's still being done. It's not just you have a really, I mean, if you said you were the director of the campaign, or you were leading one of the campaigns?
Yeah, at my university. So like we got our student union in March to agree to go 100% plant-based in the next few years.
Right.
But, it's much different in the US because like there's no student unions like the UK does.
So you're one of the very active and sort of energetic people who are involved. But if you leave, who's the person that comes behind you to take that place? And that's constantly an issue for student groups. And I think one of the most important things that you need to be mindful of in order to having a sustained campaign, and that and having a clear message that can be sort of plug and play for the new people who come in.
Thank you.
Cool. I would also suggest before you leave to connect with Mackenzie, who's in the back and is the Community Engagement Manager at World Animal Protection, and looking for opportunities to help mobilize groups like yours and others around the country. So yeah, she's in the back by the door. Thanks for all the great questions and for the rapt attendance. I would just ask the panelists to maybe conclude with any remarks, particularly a takeaway that you would want individuals to come out of this session with, and if they want to act for a climate-friendly, just, equitable, humane, and sustainable food system, what is something they should keep in mind?
I think a lot of what's been said on this panel is that our climate crisis is here and now, and that we really need to work towards kind of fueling that fire in people and spreading education and awareness about these issues, and then at the same time advocating for the necessary alternatives to help support this goal, whether via meat reduction or different sustainable alternatives. I think that it's important to work towards a future where our earth and environment can recover from kind of the devastating impacts that have already been done via factory farming, and increasing the biodiversity and restoring some of these ecosystems that were harmed by these issues, and continuing to work together and move towards that mission. Like I mentioned, collaboration is invaluable when it comes to moving forward that mission. I think that there's always power in numbers, and I'll just say that it would be great to continue working with everyone and finding new ways to collaborate.
So I would just say to maintain your sense of urgency. Do not allow the impacts of climate change to become normalized. This is an unprecedented and unusual situation that we're in, and while it's difficult because we're all just living our lives, you have to keep that front of mind, and that sense of urgency needs to feed into your actions when it comes to who you're going to vote for, who you're supporting, the actions that you're taking as a family. I'm not a big fan of personal responsibility and consumer responsibility. I don't think we're going to buy our way out. I don't think it should be the responsibility of individuals to make concerted or informed choices. I think the system should be set up for people to be able to live their lives in a way that is environmentally sustainable and can help dig our way out of this climate crisis. And that's an upstream approach, that's a policy-based approach. But putting it all on the backs of the individual, I think, is unfair. That said, as individuals, we do need to understand where we are at a point of urgency, and that we need to keep pressure on our elected officials, our administrators in terms of college students, and others, the powers that be, to make sure that we're taking this seriously and we're on the pathway to get to where we need to be.
So I agree with Craig on the urgency for sure, and I would just say, like, vote with your actions and your dollars in a sense. And I know it's a little bit at odds with what you say, but these large corporations, these retailers, when they see what consumers want, in a sense they follow the money, and in a sense supply begets demand begets supply, and it creates like a cycle. So when retailers are convinced that people want more plant-based options, their sets will have more plant-based options. And that's just going to continue to drive it. So I think 100% with the urgency, but do what you can. I mean, speak to your friends, be an advocate for the little steps and changes you can take. And, going back to the outcomes, I think 5-10 years from now, if you look at the Sweet Greens, the Kavas, the Chipotles of the world, when we look at their menus and more, the majority of the proteins they offer are plant-based as opposed to animal-based, I think those are the kind of outcomes that are going to just really start to accelerate the movement in that direction.
Thanks, everyone. And just to conclude, I'm going to try to quickly skip over that video clip I played earlier. Yep, okay. So just want to say thank you for attending our panel. It was really great to have you all turn out. If you're interested in more Climate Week events, we are doing a food truck in Washington Square Park tomorrow. We'll be open for free bao bun samples from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. featuring Eat Meaty's crispy cutlet on a great bao bun. We'll also be out there just talking about climate, plant-based eating, animal-free food eating, and the need to end factory farming to protect our planet, protect animals, and to protect ourselves. So hopefully we see you in Washington Square Park tomorrow as well, but I know it's a busy schedule of stuff. But thank you so much for coming out. It's really great to see all your faces out there and really appreciate the attendance.